My name is Linda Tracy, and I'm the Choices Bank Project Director from the Lifesend Institute. We are a local nonprofit organization that uses research to engage people and organizations in our community in the work of improving the quality of life for people who are dying and for their loved ones. Many of you may know our Executive Director, Sally Mullen. There's Sally over here. Our local research has shown that we want to direct our own health care and that we don't want to be a burden to our families. The Choices Bank in this lecture tonight can help us stay in better control of our health treatment or medical treatment and lessen the stress on those who love us. The Choices Bank, as you've been hearing about this week, the Choices Bank is a free service that makes our health care wishes known when we can't speak for ourselves. It works by making advanced directives such as living wills and powers of attorney for health care available anytime, anywhere, but only to people who should see them. I'm curious, how many people here have an advanced directive such as a living will or power of attorney for health care? Great, great. For those of you who haven't done this kind of planning yet, we have My Choices booklets out on the table that include an advanced directive form that can help you do this kind of planning for yourself and for those that love you. The Choices Bank was created by a community task force of doctors, lawyers, nurses, social workers, chaplains, aging and disabilities professionals, parish nurses, faith community leaders, and retired people who are just interested in the subject. The task force found that too often the advanced directives that could help communicate people's healthcare wishes for them could not be found when they were needed, or they could not be found quickly enough. Think about it. How quickly do you think your doctors and your loved ones could find your advanced directive? Could they find it in 5 minutes or less, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? The Choices Bank can make it available to the people who really need to see it that quickly. All you need to do is bring your advanced directive to one of Missoula's hospitals or one of the 18 other locations. Put your advanced directive in the Choices Bank and it will become easily and quickly available when it's needed. There's a brochure out on our display that will give you a list of the deposit locations and the steps that you can take to make your deposit in the Choices Bank. The Choices Bank is a collaboration of 10 local organizations and is led by the Lifesend Institute. Our partners are St. Patrick Hospital and Health Sciences Center, Community Medical Center, Western Montana Clinic, Missoula Aging Services, Partners in Home Care, Nightingale Nursing Services, Home Health of Montana, Christ the King Church and its Parish Nurse Program, and the Hospice Care Foundation. We and our partners contribute half of the Choices Bank budget, which represents a huge financial commitment by the organizations in this community towards solving the problem of making advanced directives available when they're needed. The other half of our budget comes from a grant from the United States Department of Commerce, National Telecommunications and Information Administration Technology Opportunities Program. Tonight's lecture is one in a series of Choices Bank Week events that's designed to encourage adults of any age to take 4 steps. The first is to think about our goals for medical treatment and to discuss what we would want with the people who love us most. The second is to choose someone to make decisions for us for any time we're not able to make our own decisions or speak for ourselves. The third is to document our wishes in an advanced directive, such as a living will or power of attorney for health care. And the fourth and final step is to put that advanced directive in the Choices Bank so that it can be available and work for you when you need it to. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to acknowledge and to thank our co-sponsors for this event. They are the Institute of Medicine and Humanities, Promoting Excellence in End-of-Life Care, a national program office of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Practical Ethics Center of the University of Montana, and our hosts, St. Patrick Hospital and Health Sciences Center. We appreciate your support. Tonight you're going to hear from Bill Colby about how a young woman's car crash began her family's nearly 8-year quest to honor her wishes, and how their experience benefits us today. Bill was the attorney for the family of Nancy Cruzan and argued their case before the U.S. Supreme Court. It's this landmark case that affirmed our right to accept or refuse medical treatment, even when we can't speak for ourselves, and also reinforced the value of advance directives. Since the Cruzan case, Bill has spoken across the country about ethical and legal issues related to life's end. He is currently a fellow at the Midwest Bioethics Center, the leading practical bioethics think tank located in Kansas City, Missouri, and he's also recently taught at the University of Kansas School of Law. At the time of the Cruzan case, he was an attorney with the firm of Shook, Hardy, and Bacon in Kansas City. Bill left his firm to write a book called Long Goodbye, The Deaths of Nancy Cruzan, and he'll be available to sign his book after the lecture. Will you please join me in welcoming Bill Colby to Missoula.
Thanks, Linda, very much. Good evening, everyone.
Nice to have you all out here. I've got microphones on. I got some sense of my place in the world, and it's always good to have those touchstones that you can look to. This afternoon when Linda was so gracious taking me around talking to different people, and I was talking with a reporter who said she would like to be here tonight, but that there's some news in town. There's a big debate about whether or not to have soda machines in the schools, and she really couldn't worry about me because that had to be covered. And I said, I understand, and I understand my place. So I appreciate doubly you all coming out this evening. Before I start, maybe in this formal setting, let me just say a formal thank you to the Life's End Institute and everyone there for having me out, and to Susan and to Linda for all of their hard work making this special visit. I appreciate that, and the support of the book, and for the visit in support of the book, and just being an old pal to my friend Ira Byock. I appreciate being out here. It's good to be here. How many healthcare providers or people in the medical field do we have here? Oh, a lot. How many lawyers? None. I'm outnumbered. Okay, then I need to. This is a serious and a tragic topic, so I think we need to start with a doctor joke before I go into that. When I talk with the law students, this is the only lawyer joke I tell them they should really tell. I don't like lawyer jokes, but I tell them this one's all right because it's a lawyer-doctor joke. Orthopedic surgeon and a lawyer at a cocktail party talking about their kid's soccer. Guy walks up and interrupts, said, "Doc, I'm so glad to see you. I've been having, sorry to interrupt, but I've been having this problem with my knee." He's there for 10 minutes just quizzing the guy. He has the doctor feeling his knee. He goes on and on and on. Finally says, "I really am sorry to interrupt," and he takes off. And the doctor says to the lawyer, "Can you believe that? The nerve of some people." He said, "You must get that all the time for legal advice. What do you do?" And the lawyer said, I handle it just like you did. I thought that was entirely appropriate. I'm courteous. I give the information. I help him because that's what we do." He said, "But then I do one thing you probably don't do, and that's the next day when that person gets to their office, sitting on their chair, no matter how early they get there, will be a bill from me for that advice." And the doctor laughed, and they laughed about it, said, "That's great. Maybe I'll try that." And the next day, the doctor got to his office, and sure enough, right there on his chair was a bill from the lawyer for the advice. So I let law students tell that joke because I think there's an important lesson for them about the practice of law in there, because that's just like medicine. That's part of it. I want to talk for a few minutes about the Cruzan family and their story. Some of you here may know a fair bit about that, some may not. After that, I'd like to read 3 passages, short passages from the book, then take questions for as long as people like after that. The Cruzan story starts ordinarily enough. Is that? Like a story that will start somewhere else tonight for some other family. Bad car accident, the phone call in the night from the state patrol, the family rushing down to the emergency room, getting there, sitting all night on the hard chairs waiting for some news, and then the days in the acute care facility turning into weeks, into the rehab facility, turning into months, and then years in the long-term care facility. The options, the choices for the family steadily narrowing until they're almost out of options. For the Cruzans, Nancy was in a single car accident after midnight in southwestern Missouri. She was thrown from the car. As we reconstructed it later, she went off the side of the road, hit several small trees, hit a mailbox, shot back up over a culvert, cleared the road, flipped several times, traveled the length of 3 football fields from the time she left the road till the time the car stopped. So we know she was going fast. Whether an animal crossed her path, whether she fell asleep, what caused the accident, we never did find out. Man across the street heard the noise, came out, saw the situation, ran back in, woke his father. They both came out, ultimately came back in, called the highway patrol, and soon highway patrol and ambulance arrived. As we reconstructed the story years later, it may have been as long as 30 minutes before they started resuscitation on Nancy. Everything that made her, every part of her brain that made her uniquely Nancy was gone by the time the highway patrol got there that night. Family didn't know any of that as they waited that night in the emergency room. Their education about anoxia, their knowledge about the brain's need for a constant supply of blood and glucose came over time in bits and pieces. And in the same way, their hope, you ask them, when did you lose hope? None of them can really pinpoint the moment that it happened. It came over time, up and down, until they got to a point several years later when they realized they were down to 2 options, 2 choices only, and both of them really stunk. She was then in a state hospital. They could leave her in the state hospital, unaware of the world around her. Doctors told them she would never regain awareness of the world around her. Frozen with contractures to the point that her fingernails would cut into her wrist, and they had to wedge those back and put a pillow in to stop that from happening. The only technology keeping her alive was a simple feeding tube in her stomach and turning and very attentive nursing care. Doctors said she could live 30 years in that condition. Or they could take the step to remove the feeding tube and have that hand in the death of their daughter. As they talked about it, when they finally raised the subject over a Sunday dinner, they all said, if Nancy could talk with us, she'd say, if those are my choices, I pick having the tube out. And they decided that for themselves, that was the choice they wanted as well. It was at that point that their story started to diverge from the ordinary, and by the end, it was really pretty amazing and remarkable. Nancy's parents were also her legal guardians. They went to court to be established as the decision maker. She was married at the time. Her husband became more and more detached from the situation. So it was clear that they had the decision-making power. They went to court and were declared her guardians. They had to report to the judge each year about her medical condition, financial status, whatnot. They went to the judge and told him, we've come to a point where we think we want the feeding tube removed. He told them, you can't really do that without a court order. If you do, you may be subjecting yourself to charges by some zealous prosecutor. And if I find out you're doing it, taking her home to do that, I will intervene and stop it. So they went to the state hospital and said, we want to have the feeding tube removed. We don't think there's hope for her. We've researched it, looked at it carefully. State hospital said, we cannot do that without a court order. So it was a conspiracy of strange circumstances that got this case into the courts in the first place. We had a trial in southern Missouri, a 3-day trial, after which the judge ruled in the family's favor. The case was appealed directly to the Missouri Supreme Court, where the court ruled against the family 4-3, and then we petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to take the case. U.S. Supreme Court had turned down the Quinlan case from New Jersey in the past, and 2 other cases that I knew about dealing with right to die. The Supreme Court takes a very small percentage of the appeals filed at the court, less than 3% each year typically. So your chances aren't good that the Supreme Court will say, yes, we'll take your case. But they decided for whatever reason to take the Cruzan's case. And at that point, the family found themselves moving from the local stage in Missouri onto a national stage. Many groups in our society came out in support of the family. At appellate courts, Supreme Courts of states, and the federal Supreme Court, interest groups can file papers with the court supporting one side or another in a case. They're called amicus, or friends of the court briefs. In our case, there were over twice as many briefs filed by interest groups as there had been in Roe v. Wade, the abortion case at the court. A lot of people interested. For the family, American Hospital Association, American Medical Association, American Nursing Association, many religious groups, many ethical groups, just a lot of support from around the country. But many groups on the other side as well. The state of Missouri actively opposed the family. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which is a very powerful lobbying group in Washington and a group the court listens to. And the federal government decided to wade into the case, and they picked the side of the state of Missouri as well. They were led at the time by the former federal judge, Kenneth Starr. So by that point, there was nothing ordinary about the Cruzan's case at all. It was pretty remarkable. After the Supreme Court, the court gave us a way to have a second trial, which we did. Again, received permission to remove the feeding tube. It was removed at the state hospital. Protesters from around the country descended on the hospital, set up a tent city on the lawn, satellite television trucks out front, and a hospital in a complete lockdown. Only the front door of the hospital open for entrance and exit. And at one point, 32 police officers manning the divide between the family and the protesters. So by the end, there was nothing ordinary about their situation at all. It was really pretty amazing and pretty extraordinary. I don't know if this is true for all lawyers, but I can speak anecdotally for myself. Not statistically significant, but I know it's true for me. When people find out that a lawyer's written a book, they say a couple of things. One is, as they read it, and I like to say this, the Library Journal said my book was well written, which is kind of like your high school math teacher saying, you really added that properly. I mean, it was really nice. But people read a book and they say, did you have help writing this? Because this isn't how lawyers write. But the other thing they ask is, well, is it a law book? Is it a book for lawyers? And there is some law in it, given the path I just described, but it's not a law book, and nor is it for lawyers. It's a book about and for people. Important to remember that, indeed, lawyers are people too, so they may well want to read the book, but it's not a law book. It's a book about people and what happens in society when we put people under that kind of pressure, in that kind of crucible. And to a great extent, the book is about family and about Nancy Cruzan's father, Joe Cruzan. And how he dealt with the stress of this case and where he looked to find the moral anchor to deal with the world around him that he just had trouble understanding on many days. So the first passage I'd like to read, if I could, is right from the start of the book. It's not chapter 1. Chapter 1 starts with the accident and moves forward chronologically, but this is a half-page inset before chapter 1. It's not a prologue. It's not big enough to be a prologue, but it starts with Joe from a much more recent time than the accident. Oh, that won't work. Carterville, Missouri, August 17th, 1996, 3 a.m. The heat in the southwestern corner of Missouri near Oklahoma seldom relents in August, even in the middle of the night. On August 17, 1996, likely just before 3 in the morning, 62-year-old Joe Cruzan rose from the twin bed he slept in alone, wedged against the wall in a tiny, narrow bedroom he'd made for himself in the back corner of his house. He looked like the empty shell of the sheet metal worker he'd once been. His square shoulders now stooped as if the muscles were missing, and his skin just hung on his collarbones. Black circles ringed his bloodshot eyes, and the thick gray calluses that used to be on each hand were gone, replaced by soft pink buttons, smaller than a dime. By the summer of 1996, on the rare occasion when Joe Cruzan ventured out of his house and ran into someone he knew, that person would need to look twice to make sure it was really Joe. Once out of his bed, Joe made his way to the kitchen, and in an unsteady hand, he began this note to his wife. Joyce, 1, I love you. 2, I love Chris and Donna, and especially Angie and Miranda. 3, call police before going on carport. Joe finished his numbered instructions and left the note on the kitchen table in a conspicuous spot. Then he headed out the side door of his house into the humid August night. One of the main themes of the story is Joe's growing frustration with the world around him the deeper he got into this process. He couldn't understand why, with a room of people like this, you wouldn't all agree with him as a matter of morals, ethics, religion, law, whatever the standard, that for a woman in her 20s in a persistent vegetative state with no hope of recovering consciousness, the right decision was removing the feeding tube. And he couldn't understand, he'd stand in front of this room and talk with you, but he couldn't understand why any of you would want to give him your opinion. To his credit, whether it was the pro-life people against him or the other side people who were for him, he didn't think they had any business in his family's decision making. He thought it was the family's choice and put outsiders on the outside. And the pace of the legal system conspired with everything else really to drive him to the edge of madness. We went from trial, Missouri Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, second trial, 7 emergency appeals in 3 years and a few days. In the lawyer's world, that was a sprint. A lot of things had to conspire to make all that happen so quickly. To Joe, it seemed like it took forever, and the waiting for courts and hearing from a court, and then the deadline for filing the next appeal, and the time for filing briefs, and then the month-long reply to the next brief. It just tore at him over that 3-year period in a very difficult way. The part I'm going to read next is from just after we received the decision from the Missouri Supreme Court against the family. Missouri was the first state high court to decide against a family in one of these cases. We were expecting that day to go down to the courthouse, pick up the decision, and go to the state hospital and remove the feeding tube. Did not turn out that way. Then came Christmas, The part I'm going to read is from January, just after that year. It's under the title, chapter 30 of the book, of Writing Governor Ashcroft. Our governor at the time was John Ashcroft. The coming of the new year in 1989 may not have returned hope or faith in the system to Joe, but it did seem to revive his stubborn streak, and he began to write letters, lots of them. Even before the accident and subsequent chain of events, Joe Cruzan had called himself the lightning rod, the guy who stirred things up. He had never been one to sit home and watch football on television. In a yellow file kept in his bedroom marked simply "My Letters," years of correspondence accumulated. In April of 1979, for example, he wrote his congressman, including Senator John Danforth, about proposed congressional pay raises. Dear Senator Danforth, I am mayor of Carterville for the sum of $10 per month. If you people cannot make ends meet on the paltry sum of $66,125 to $82,500 plus perks per year, I simply cannot find words to express my indignation. It saddens me to see my country go down the chute, but I honestly feel this is happening, and largely because of leadership in the federal government that puts its own selfish interest before that of the nation. God help my children and grandchildren. As always, Joe sent copies of his letters to the Joplin Globe. Senator Danforth's professional but obviously edgy two-page response to Joe concluded this issue is a complex one and easily falls prey to simple rhetoric. The senator's response only spurred Joe, never one to give up the last word on a subject, to write more. Dear Senator Danforth, my wife and I made a combined $25,000 in 1978. You made 3 times as much and need a pay increase? I stand by my simplistic rhetoric. I think the Joplin Globe hit the nail on the head. They printed my letter under their heading, Congress Taking Care of Number 1. The point of this chapter is we had a hard winter that year in Missouri. Joe he's a high school educated sheet metal worker. He was off work a lot, and he spent most of that winter at his typewriter. When a local construction contract was awarded to an out-of-town contractor, he wrote several letters to the editor. When the Mothers Against Drunk Driving were having problems with the seatbelt laws, he got involved with that. There was a planned march on City Hall by Mothers Against Pornography in Joplin. Joe wrote, some time ago I vowed no more letters to the editor, but I can't help myself. Will people never learn? You cannot legislate morals. You never could. You never will. He wrote the local Nightline affiliate saying, why in the world would you have Magnum PI on before Nightline? I keep falling asleep during Magnum, which everyone should do anyway because it's terrible, and I can't stay up for Nightline. Please switch them. He wrote Stephen Bochco at LA Law saying, I saw your show last night on PBS. If you ever do another one, call me, because you obviously didn't talk with anyone who has a family member in this condition before you had the show on last night, because it doesn't resemble what it's really like. When Joe was reading the paper or watching the television, his typewriter was never far away. In January of 1989, there was a news story in our papers about Missouri planning the first execution in many, many years. Like a lot of states, capital punishment was being revived, and Missouri was on that path as well. In our Missouri Supreme Court decision in Cruzan, the court said, we don't know exactly what the law is here. The legislature should figure this out, because the court, it's not really a question for the courts. But if we're going to err in Missouri, we're going to err on the side of life. In Missouri, our interest is in life. That interest is unqualified. The court said that 3 times in the opinion. Well, Joe called me that morning and said, wait a second. If our state interest in life is unqualified, how can we be executing people? And, you know, I tried to give him some lawyer reason why these are different, which was completely unsatisfying to him. So he headed to the typewriter and wrote a long and passionate letter to Governor Ashcroft, and the chapter ends with the governor's response to Joe about the issues and what his views were on the issues. After the Missouri Supreme Court case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, 9 justices, we had 5 separate opinions written by the court. There was something in there for everyone. The court New York Times headline said, Supreme Court finds new constitutional right. St. Louis Post-Dispatch headline said, Supreme Court decides against the Cruzans. And they were both right. The court did say for the first time that all of us, conscious, competent people, have a federal constitutional right to make decisions about our medical treatment. It had never said that before. It also said, if you patch the different opinions together, that a feeding tube is a medical treatment like a respirator or any other medical treatment. It's a technology that is put in place to serve as a bridge to recovery, but the fact that it's feeding is really no different than a respirator bringing air to a patient. It's still medical technology. But the court said the Constitution does not prohibit a state, when someone's wishes are unclear, from putting a higher standard of proof in place before treatments stop. Therefore, if Missouri wants to require clear and convincing evidence before treatment stop for an incapacitated person, we're not saying that's the standard you should have. All we're saying is the Constitution does not prohibit that from happening. They gave us an avenue in the opinion based on new evidence to have a second trial, as I said, which we did the following fall. Again, the trial judge ruled in our favor. This time the state of Missouri did not appeal the case. The feeding tube was removed shortly after that, and then we had that circus-like setting at the state hospital that I described to you earlier. The Cruzan's focus, as it had throughout, at the end remained with family and with Nancy. So the last passage I want to read is from Christmas Day of 1990. By late afternoon, the nurse who came on after Angela could not detect Nancy's blood pressure. Her breathing had become slightly more rapid, and she was less reactive to stimuli. At 5:05 p.m., Dr. Davis downgraded Nancy's condition from serious to critical, yet her appearance remained peaceful. The trembling of the day before had stopped, and by now even her neck had grown less rigid. The family sat around Nancy's bed, talking, holding her hands, praying. When the new nurse arrived at midnight, Joyce asked that she not turn Nancy or try to take her blood pressure. Joyce, that's Nancy's mother, didn't want Nancy to be disturbed any further. Joe kept falling asleep in a chair, and Joyce made him go across the hallway to rest in a bed. She told him they would come get him if anything changed. Chris, that's Nancy's sister, was lying on the floor in a camping mat that Uncle George had brought, dozing on and off. George sat in a chair doing the same. Joyce stayed awake. Around 1 a.m, Nancy's breathing grew more labored. At about 1:15 a.m., she spit up a tablespoon of dark, foul-smelling liquid. Joyce cleaned it away and called out to Uncle George, "George, go get Joe." Joe walked back in the room with his uncle, startled out of an uneasy sleep, Joe's hair going in several directions. George left to go get coffee to leave the Cruzans alone. The three of them stood around Nancy's bed. Nancy's breathing grew weaker. For the next hour and a half, they held her hands, kissed her, and told her they loved her. Joe put his forehead on Nancy's and whispered, "Everything will be okay." Around 2:30 a.m., Nancy's breathing grew even more labored. A book one nurse had given Joe called it fish out of water breathing. Joe cradled Nancy's head in his arms. Joyce stood right next to him, holding Nancy's hand. Chris stood across the bed, rubbing her other hand. At 2:47 a.m., Nancy's breathing stopped. Joe reached his hand to Nancy's face and pulled her eyelids closed. Uncle George looked back into the room and saw the end had come. He walked down to the nursing station and said, "I think it's over." 15 minutes later, Joe reached me in Florida. "Bill?" "Hi, Joe," I said, not fully roused from a sound sleep. "It's over," he said. His voice was clear and steady. "Thank God," I said. He told me about the last few hours. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. He paused for a time, the question harder than it sounded. "I guess we'll all go home," he said. When I started the process of trying to write this book, I had what may seem like a pretty small goal, but it seemed big enough to me. And that was, I just wanted to preserve this family's story on the written page. I felt like they'd earned that from the rest of us. And now that that's done, I actually feel pretty good about how that turned out. And the goals are getting a little more ambitious. I hope people will take this book and take this story and read it and then act upon it. I think if we can, that will be a real service to the Cruzan family's legacy. Being in Missoula is a little bit like being in Kansas City. You don't realize that most cities, there aren't people talking about end-of-life stuff too much. I mean, it happens here all the time because of the demonstration project. It happens in Kansas City all the time because of the Bioethics Center. We really have good community engagement and involvement. My guess is here, like Kansas City, it's not all solved yet. There's still work to do, and we certainly have work to do in Kansas City, but we are way at the front of the choir. As we've looked at the issue, we found that if you get a community group and you get somebody like me, a lawyer, standing up there in front saying, boy, you really need to do a living will because something bad could happen to you, a car accident, yeah, I'll get to it. And then you go do something else. But if you share stories and you hear a story about another family, and then you talk to your loved ones about it, it just maybe can trigger some action so that I'm taking this book and going everywhere I can. And hopefully if that can cause some families to act so that they avoid some of the problems the Cruzans have, then I think that will be a good goal to pursue, and it's one that I'm going to work for. So, thank you, and any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes, ma'am. The question was, what kind of financial burden was this to the Cruzan family? It was actually none. Her first couple of years of hospitalization were paid through private insurance from her employer. After that, she was in a state facility, was completely paid for by the state.
So all the reports
My law firm donated the legal fees and the expenses as lawyers and doctors and others do. It was part of our public service. Yes, sir.
Was John Ashcroft still the governor when the second trial, the final trial, happened?
He was.
Why didn't they reappeal?
The Attorney General of Missouri was the main advocate in the case. The governor was never overly, his Department of Health opposed the family, but in part that was because we sued a facility in the Department of Health, so they had to oppose the family. He was never actively involved in the case. The Attorney General said at the time that he felt like they'd set the standard. Now we knew what the standard was, and he didn't think the state had a further role in the case at that point. And I talk a little bit more about, there were political issues involved, and I talk some about that in the book. But I don't for a second, I don't agree with either Attorney General Webster's or Governor Ashcroft's position in the case. I think they were wrong. I don't stand here and say, but it didn't make any sense. It's a very hard social issue. It was harder then than it is now. And I don't know that we should ever take the step of having an injured person in our society, of removing medical treatment, whether it's a feeding tube or anything else, without a lot of careful deliberation and discussion to make sure that's the right decision. But they were not, they bowed out of appealing the second trial because they said the standard had been set. Yes, sir.
It's not this person asking this type of question. I'm wondering about his background.
The question was the religious background of the family, myself, and the law firm, and how that affected the case. The Cruzans are Methodists. Nancy was not, if you read the book, you'll see she was not an active churchgoer by her teenage years and then beyond, although her father always said she was a spiritual person, but not an active church person. The family went to church. They said religion played no role in their decision. They said it was just a matter of what they thought was right based on whatever personal rules guided their family decision-making. As far as our law firm, we had people on both sides of the issue. There were people that thought we should not be doing the case. The largest client of my firm is Philip Morris. So there were people saying that about a lot of our clients, and that's what lawyers do.
So the religious background involved in the law firm, not fit to play a role in the law firm.
The question was the background of the firm didn't play a part. It did to this extent, not religious at all. I was a new lawyer at the firm. I'd been practicing out east and had just come back to Kansas City. One of the senior people at the firm was active in the local ACLU. The family had called the ACLU trying to find a lawyer, and so out of now our firm's 600 lawyers, and I think he's still probably the only Democrat in the firm, but they found him, and I'm not there anymore, by the way, but they found him, and he referred the case to me. So I guess that connection there is a social side to it. He referred it to me saying, I don't think it'll amount to much, probably a half-day trial in probate court. 6 years and a whole life view later, we were done with this half-day trial. Yes, ma'am.
What difference would an advance directive have made, and are there states in which an advance directive doesn't make any difference because of state laws?
The question was, what difference would an advance directive have made, and are there states in which it would not have made any difference because of state laws? My 82-year-old mother says that very question is explained clearly in the book to her, the relationship of constitutional to common law and state law, but let me give a quick summary. The state of Montana can pass a statute which says, here are the rules by which we want living wills executed, written. Here's how we think they should be written, and it might define terminally, I haven't looked at Montana's, but it might define terminally ill. It might say they can only be used in certain situations. It might or might not treat feeding tubes differently from other technologies. Some states do, Missouri does. So they can pass that law. You can execute that document, and you have certain protections provided by the state law. But trumping all state law is the federal Constitution, which gives us all certain rights. So if I have a right to a determination about my body, and I say to this group gathered here, if I'm incapacitated, I want you all to be witness that my wife gets to decide, just as with full powers if I were deciding. I've now exercised a constitutional right. It doesn't exactly fit the way the writing's supposed to happen under the state, but have I executed a living will or an advance directive? If she had done that in the time, would that have trumped the state statute? Would it have come out differently? Maybe. It's hard to know that, but the way laws interrelate, the more clear you make your wishes, the more you empower an advocate once you make those wishes clear to say, this is what I really want, and when push comes to shove, I want you to make sure that it happens this way, the better chance you have of your wishes being granted. But as I read coming out on the plane in a lovely book called Dying Well by Dr. Byock, it's so right. It's not black and white. It's this mass of gray, and the law in the area, just like the medicine, is very gray. I'm waiting for someone to say, if you order 10 of these on Amazon, does it really jump the numbers up? Or Yes, sir.
At the state trial level, was there an important distinction made between feeding tube and, say, oxygen or some other kind of support? Secondly, I serve on a medical staff ethics committee here, and so I know that most things that get to the community are not ethical questions of conflict. At any point, was this issue considered by an ethics committee either for initial hospital or the state hospital?
Let me answer the second question first. Again, these decisions are made all of the time without courts, and a lot of circumstances had to come together for this case to make its way into the courts. One of those was that she had to remain in the state hospital, because when our firm got involved, we talked about moving to a private facility where it wouldn't necessarily be thrust at the state, where you have the state's lawyer saying you have to have a court order to do that here. Well, that wasn't necessarily the case at private hospitals or nursing homes, but or even at the emergency room. In one of the paradoxes of the vegetative state, the family believed that their daughter had no perception of the world around her and never would again, but they didn't want to disturb that world. She'd lived at that state facility for a long time, and they said, that's her home, and if what we're doing is right, we ought to do it here. So they were part of the reason that the case moved its way into courts. And your first question, there was a lot of argument at the trial about the nature of a feeding tube, and is this a treatment that is up to the very edge? Is this something that's so simple and so basic that we really shouldn't call that medical technology? It's simple feeding food and water. So we spent a lot of time on that issue.
There never was formal ethics committee consideration of the issues of her case?
There was no ethics committee at the state hospital in 1987 when they first went to the hospital administrator to seek removal. I don't know if there's one today or not. I don't believe there was one throughout the course of the trial. Yes, ma'am.
Did the bioethics center exist at the time, or did that form in response to this? And what relationship did the ethics center have with either the legal community or just the community in general?
The bioethics center at the time the case started was one lady some of us know well, with a steel desk in a small room and no money, no budget, no printing budget, no salary budget, just a woman whose mom had died in bad circumstances and she wasn't happy about it. So she was going to do something about that. The center grew up alongside Cruzan. Missouri was the focus, a national focus for several years of this issue, and the center grew along with the case and the issue, but no, at the time it didn't really exist. Yes, sir.
Was there any context that this all happened for the decision? If it was foreign area or just medical decisions that the girls in abstract and what the conclusions were, or did the whole thing align in the context around Dr. McCarthy and common law, all those kinds of choices? Was it even more mainstream discussions going on the edge in terms of legal arguments and opposition at the tug of war overall? Stay more mainstream, go off the edge.
The question was, at the time, did the arguments stay more mainstream, or were people saying, I'll paraphrase, were people saying, you're no different than Dr. Kevorkian with what you're trying to do? There was some of that. There was some of that. I mean, there was, at trial, I really struggled with the question of whether to raise the cost of her care as an issue. Because when you talk about that with regard to one specific individual, it sounds like you're saying this life doesn't deserve to be lived. That's not what we were saying. We were saying the parents believed that would not be her choice. But if you're spending $130,000 a year to to keep someone in a persistent vegetative state. State money, is that how to allocate that resource? And the judge wanted to talk about it, and the lawyers on the other side wanted to talk about it. So I didn't want to talk about it because it was just too dangerous for me. But I said it once. One question out of 2,000 pages of transcripts, one question. And I had in the appellate briefs that question brought back saying this is just like the Nazi doctors raising starting from small beginnings and calling this life not worth living. So the issue, it did come up. But for the most part, the debate was in the mainstream. Yeah.
Just an observation, sort of response to that comment. Those of us who were, bioethics was also emerging during this time very rapidly. Things were being written about this case, about other cases. And those of us who were struggling with these issues politically and the ethics kind of movement were scared about this decision. When it was watching it come through the Missouri court and go to the Supreme Court, we were really worried. We thought things were getting clearer after the Quinlan case in New Jersey. And we were really worried that the court went the other way and said no. We didn't know what that would mean in terms of how it would be permissible for people to die. As I read the New Jersey decision, they were very clear that animals often died because they couldn't eat anymore. And if you started treating them with artificial nutrition, you didn't really give them a way out. And we thought, well, if that was, if that was found basically to be wrong at the federal level, and then they were going to say the same thing about the antibiotics when that person asked the reason, well, it was just antibiotics. Why, couldn't allow somebody to die the longer you could treat. It was, we were really worried. We watched this and thought, and I guess like that. What was that as a question? What do you think would have happened had things gone the other way?
I remember you guys discussing too, quietly saying, didn't Chuck Hardy have any of the more senior guys they could put on this? I was 32 when the case started. The U.S. Supreme Court was my second appellate argument. I wasn't, my plates in my brain were just starting to close. I wasn't smart enough to know I shouldn't be there. But the law, it gets made in very amorphous ways and strange ways, and we muddle through, but we basically after some point come to the right decision. And I think Cruzan was part of that. It's probably the law isn't what's most important. What Cruzan did was cause all of us to think about and talk about what we should want. It caused a lot of hospital ethics committees to be formed. It caused hospital ethics committees to visit these issues, and so it fostered the discussion.
But if it went the other way, there would probably be, or have been for a number of years, a lot of people in persistent vegetative states getting beaten.
Maybe, but even in Missouri, where people thought that the law did go the other way, because you still had the clear and convincing evidence standard in place. The Missouri decision was not overruled in toto, so it still stood. We had 53,000 people dying each year, and most of them as a result of the decision in some way or another. So medicine, even in Missouri, medicine continued to be practiced in the best interest of the patient in consultation with the family. How many know a medical provider who has, at the end of life, talked with the family, counseled them, made a decision in the best interest of the patient, and stopped some treatment? How many know someone who's done that? And now how many know someone who's been sued for that decision under some theory of medical battery or malpractice? It doesn't happen. It's just not, it's not a risk. And even in Missouri, where our law is still not clear, it's just not a risk.
That's example is very young woman. I wonder how much age plays
The question was, Nancy was young at the time, did age play a role? There were a couple of studies done about gender playing a role, that all of these cases seem to be about women. Men get to make those decisions, or families get to make the decisions about men, but the women apparently needed to be protected by society. As far as age, maybe it played a role, but I don't know. Yes. Okay. Well, I did this for 6 or 7 years, and I quit my job in the middle of my life to write a book in my basement with my wife walking by shaking her head every day saying, "What are you doing?" So, who knows how something, it affected me in, I joke, it affected me in profound ways. And maybe the best thing I got out of the Cruzan case was to being around people who were so strong under such extreme circumstances. Anytime I even find a little snippet of wine coming into my life, I say, forget it. Your life's good. You're not worrying about that, because that's not the way it works. Mr. Cruzan committed suicide in 1996. Mrs. Cruzan in 1999, after several years of relative joy and good health out from under Joe's cloud, found out she had lymphoma and decided not to treat it, went home with hospice, and had a very good month at home with hospice. And Chris, Nancy's sister, has come out somehow on the other side of all that. So, well, she's talking with groups about these issues and what families should do, and she talks to a lot of families who call and say, "We're at such and such hospital, and here's our problem. What do we do?" So she has taken that energy to help others. Yes, sir.
What was their experience socially and locally while this was going on? And the people they always known, they go to the grocery store, have that information in their church,
Their experience locally was generally very, very supportive. Some not, but generally very, very good. A couple more, and then I'll go outside and, yes, sir.
The second trial following the Supreme Court decision, the new evidence that you presented, I believe, was just verbal testimony.
Correct.
And I'm wondering, after this long, hard ordeal, how verbal testimony was considered adequate to show her which testimony was written.
The court never said to us, here's how we define clear and convincing evidence. We had two conversations. One was corroborated, and it was very helpful. She had worked for a short period of time at a school for deaf and blind children, and Nancy had the job of force feeding a 3-year-old girl who was the size of an infant, non-responsive, and they had a conversation one day, a very specific conversation about force feeding someone who Nancy repeatedly called a vegetable. So we had it's anecdotal, but it was fairly specific. Part of it was, though, too, you're talking about society changing. I mean, we were back for a second trial before a judge who had ruled in our favor the first time, and now the state had decided not to be actively involved. So part of it was just coming to a policy decision as a society that maybe what the family's doing is right here. And again, what the law's role was maybe less important. Yes, sir.
I guess I don't really want to ask financial expenditures that were firm. What I really want to know is what might it have cost someone who could have afforded to do everything, including, Supreme Court briefs and all that. What might that have cost for someone who could have afforded it?
It was the cost from start to finish was a little over $1 million. It's like 1.1.
That's
That's legal fees and out of pocket. You know, boy, the cost, if the cost had been 1.1, I would have been writing the book much earlier. When the partners found out that I just bought $1 million in plane tickets, I'd have been out here in like '88 talking about it. But the total, but for large law firms, that's what they're supposed to do. And we did that gladly, and I was glad to have the opportunity. So, again, thanks, and I'll be out here and happy to answer questions as long as we can in casing. I have to do one more question, so I will.
I just want to know in the introduction that you read, was this the more or less, looks like no big deal,
It was, and the book ends with the conclusion of that note.
Thank you, Bill, very much, and Bill will be available